Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany the readings on Sartre, which begin on page 226 of our PDF. And I had asked you to skip a couple of those pages, pages 229 and pages 230, in an attempt to make the reading assignment a little bit easier on you guys, a little bit more succinct. But before we get into a discussion of an analysis rather, of the reading assignment, I want to bring up the visual aid that I've used previously. So we're still on the same topic of the free will versus determinism debate. And we started off by looking at the hard determinism of Baron Dolbach, and we talked about why some people don't like that position because it denies moral responsibility. But at the same time, it kind of seems hard to act as if, let me rephrase that. It seems hard to completely deny the truth of determinism, because in doing that, then we abandon any science of psychology. So philosophers such as Daniel Dennett and others came up with this theory called soft determinism or compatibilism, in which they are accepting that, well, yes, we still, we live in a physical universe that's governed by physical causal law, but that doesn't mean that we can't hold people morally accountable for their actions. And at the end of that discussion, I had mentioned as to why some people still aren't happy with that, because some people make the argument that if you accept any degree of determinism, then it just ends up conflating into, devolving into some version of hard determinism. So we still don't really have the kind of moral responsibility that we're looking for. So enter Sartre and existential libertarianism. And I'm using that specific phrase here because Sartre's theory of existentialism goes well beyond what philosophical libertarianism is. So we're not defining Sartre as a philosophical libertarian. What we're saying is that there are philosophical libertarian implications to Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. So we're only going to be looking at those aspects of Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism which involve that indeterminist philosophical libertarian position. So just a recap of what that is. Libertarianism, indeterminism in this sense, is going to be denying the truth of determinism, but only in the case of human actions. And that's an important proviso for Jean-Paul Sartre. What Jean-Paul Sartre is going to say that human beings are singularly unique. What Sartre is going to say is that everything else in the universe is governed by physical, determined causal law. Human beings are different. And because human beings are different, Jean-Paul Sartre says, precisely because we are different, because we have that free will, that is what gives rise to moral responsibility. More precisely, because of our radical freedom. Dogs do not have radical freedom. Clouds do not have radical freedom. If a cloud rains on your picnic, you might get upset, but you don't hold the cloud morally accountable. If a dog urinates on your carpet, you might get upset. You might even punish the dog, but you don't hold the dog morally accountable, right? If I show up and urinate on your carpet, well, now the situation is different, right? And that's what Jean-Paul Sartre is going to say. What Jean-Paul Sartre is going to say, the cloud is just an object that inhabits a universe, and therefore it is governed by physical, these deterministic causal law. The dog is a physical thing that inhabits a physical universe and therefore is governed by these deterministic law. Human beings, however, are different. So that's the position of Jean-Paul Sartre. And so let's talk about that. So the title of this, we create ourselves through our choices. Notice that we are not born into this world to be a specific thing. You don't have to live a specific kind of life. That is what the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre is going to be saying. There's no life that you have to live, and because of that, there are no actions that you have to do. You are free. You are condemned to be free. You are radically free, and that's an interesting phrase. Condemned to be free, and Jean-Paul Sartre uses that specific phrase. And what he means by that is that we cannot escape our freedom, that we as human beings cannot exist without making choices. A cloud can exist without making choices, right? Because the cloud's behavior and actions are just dictated by these external events. Human beings, Jean-Paul Sartre says, are different. And because we're different, we are morally accountable precisely because of that free will. So let's get to this indented area here and start talking about some of the things that Jean-Paul Sartre said. One of the more famous statements associated with Jean-Paul Sartre and his version of existentialism is this kind of cryptic phrase here: existence precedes essence. Now, the way to understand that is to understand what he's denying. So to reverse that, if you say that essence precedes existence, then that means that, I'll just use myself as an example. To say that essence precedes existence means that there's some essence of Dan Heberness that was already in the universe. And at the time that I was born, my task is to live the life of Dan Heber. And what Sartre is going to do is say, well, no, there is no essence of me that was already in the universe. My task is not to live a certain kind of life. I don't have to do anything, right? I'm free. I'm condemned to be free. I'm radically free. What Jean-Paul Sartre is going to say is that I become a certain kind of person. The kind of person I become is not written in the fabric of the cosmos, right? I don't have to be anything. I don't have to do anything. I become a certain thing. And I become a certain thing as a result of the choices that I made. So I exist first, right? Existence precedes essence. So think of, you know, cheaters, and here I'm talking about, romantic cheaters, people that cheat in romantic relationships. Nobody's born a cheater, right? You become a cheater. And what Jean-Paul Sartre's going to ask is, well, how does a person become a cheater? Well, clearly you become a cheater as a result of a choice that you made. So you make the choice, and as a result of making that choice, now you are something, right? You weren't born a cheater, you became a cheater. How did you become a cheater? You made that choice. You weren't born a liar, you become a liar, right? How did you become a liar? Well, you made the choice to lie. So there's nothing about any individual human being's essence that makes them destined to become a dishonest person. Some people are dishonest, right? Some people are honest. And what's the difference between them? Well, they make different choices. The honest person makes honest choices. The dishonest person makes dishonest choices. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre's saying is, and if you don't like being a dishonest person, well, guess what? You're radically free. Just because you were a liar yesterday doesn't mean that you have to be a liar today. Just because you were the kind of person who would cheat on his romantic partner yesterday doesn't mean that you have to be that same kind of person today, right? You don't have to be anything. And Jean-Paul Sartre uses the example of a paper cutter, a penknife, basically, is what he's talking about there. And using that as an example of something that has an essence. There's something that a penknife is supposed to be, right? So in the case of an object, objects have an essence. There's something that a penknife is supposed to do, and we designed the penknife around that task that we already had in mind. But what Jean-Paul Sartre is going to say, he's going to be making this distinction between a subject and an object. Objects have an essence. There's something that an object is supposed to do. But you, Jean-Paul Sartre says, are not an object. You are a subject. And because you are a subject, there's nothing that you have to do. There's no kind of life that you have to live. There's no kind of existence that you must maintain. You are free to do whatever you want. Now, there are some implications that arise from this. So this phrase here, where Jean-Paul Sartre says that man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Again, he's reiterating this notion that there's nothing that we had to be. Nobody is born with it written in the fabric of the universe that they are going to cheat on their romantic partners, right? Some people are cheaters, some people aren't. And what's the difference between them? The choices that they make. And there are no choices that you were destined to do, right? You do something as a result of of your will, and you become a certain kind of person as a result of that. So that's what Jean-Paul Sartre means here in this green highlighted passage, whenever he says that existentialism's first move is to make every man aware of what he is. You're a subject, not an object, of what he is, and to make the full responsibility of his existence rest on him. So the responsibility of a dog's existence doesn't lie on the dog, right? The dog's an object, according to Jean-Paul Sartre. And because the dog is an object, you can't hold a dog morally accountable. Again, if a dog urinates on your carpet, you might get upset. You don't hold the dog morally accountable. If I show up at your house and urinate on your carpet, well, now the situation is different, right? Because what are you going to say is, well, you're not a dog. You're not an animal. You're not an object. You're a subject. And as a subject, you can be held morally accountable, right? The cloud is not a subject, it's an object. It's not the kind of thing that can have moral accountability and moral responsibility. Humans, according to Jean-Paul Sartre, are singularly unique in that respect. Everything else in the universe is an object. Human beings are subject. And so what Jean-Paul Sartre wants to do is to remind people of their freedom, right? You are different from everything else. Okay, I'm going to scroll through those aforementioned pages. Now we're at the top of page 231. I'm going to read this pink highlighted passage. Jean-Paul Sartre says, in creating the man that we want to be, and again, you'll have to forgive the language. He wrote this in, 1943? I can't remember what the date was of this. I think it was 43. No, Being a Nothingness was 1943. I can't remember the year. We're looking at excerpts from Existentialism as a Humanism. That was actually probably a year or two before Being in Nothingness. But I don't want to waste a bunch of time looking for that right now. So notice that we're looking at this pink, reading this pink highlighted passage, and we're sort of picking up from a portion of the PDF that I didn't assign, which is talking about responsibility. So objects can't have responsibility. There's nothing. It doesn't make any sense to have, to speak of the responsibility of something if it could not have done otherwise, right? So objects are governed by those deterministic causal forces. And what Sartre is adamant about is that you are not an object, you are a subject. You don't have to do anything. You are in charge. But because you are in charge, now you have a responsibility, right? You have a responsibility in the way that a dog doesn't. A dog is not responsible for its actions. It's a dog. You are not a dog. You are not an object. You are, in fact, accountable for your actions. So that's what Sartre means here when he says that in creating the man that we want to be, there is not a single one of our acts which does not at the same time create an image of the man we think we ought to be. Now, that's a very cryptic phrase. What Jean-Paul Sartre means by that is that we are free. So there's nothing that we have to do, right? You don't have to do anything. If you don't want to go to college, don't go to college, right? If you don't want to get married, don't get married. You don't have to do anything. You are free. You are radically free. You are condemned to be free. But because you are free, you now have the responsibility of the choices that you make. You now get to decide what kind of life to live. And because you're the one making that decision, now you are responsible. So what is the source of that responsibility? Well, Jean-Paul Sartre is an atheist, and so the responsibility doesn't come from God, at least on Jean-Paul Sartre's version of existentialism. There are there is such a thing as religious existentialism. Writers such as Soren Kierkegaard, Gabriel Marcel. We're not talking about those. They're not in our textbook, and we're going to be talking about the most famous version of existentialism, which is Jean-Paul Sartre's version of existentialism. So what Jean-Paul Sartre means here, again, just to go back to the text and textual analysis, that the source of our responsibility comes not just the fact that I'm making a decision, but because I'm making decisions in the presence of other human beings. So to go back and reread this and unpack it a little bit, in creating the man that I want to be, there is not a single one of our acts which does not at the same time create an image of man as we think he ought to be. What Jean-Paul Sartre means there is that whenever we make decisions, whenever we make actions, we are doing so in the presence of others. And so whenever we decide to do something, such as, let's see, I thought I had it highlighted where he talks about the decision to get married. Oh, yes, here it is. Right in there, right in here. Sorry, I thought I had that highlighted already. I'm going to go ahead and do that while I'm recording here. Let's go ahead. We'll make that yellow. So as Jean-Paul Sartre says, if I want to marry, to have children, even if this marriage depends solely on my own circumstances or passion or wish, I am involving all humanity in monogamy and not merely myself. So what he means by that is that, if you make the choice to get married, now of course you don't have to make the choice to get married. Again, if you want to be single, be single. If you want to get married, be married. If you want to have kids, have kids. If you don't want kids, don't have kids. There's no life that you have to live. There are no actions that you have to do, that you must do. You are free. But whenever I'm married, I'll use myself as an example. Whenever I made the decision to get married and to be, monogamous and faithful to my wife, that's the example that Jean-Paul Sartre is using here. Even if this marriage depends solely on my own circumstances, right? I'm the one who's making that decision. I decide to get married. I decide to be, to be loyal and faithful to my wife. Even if that, I'm still involving all humanity in monogamy and not merely myself. What Jean-Paul Sartre means by that is that the reason I made that choice to get married is clearly because I thought that was the best choice, right? Why on earth would I have gotten married if I didn't think it was the best choice? So what Jean-Paul Sartre is going to say is that there would be something inauthentic for me to say, well, yeah, I got married, but I didn't think it was the best idea, right? The fact that I got married presupposes that I think it's a good thing. For otherwise, why do it, right? But whenever we say it's a good thing, we don't understand that as just being some idiosyncratic preference on my behalf. What I'm really saying by the act of getting married and being faithful to my wife is that this is how people should live. Not just me, but this is how I think people should behave within the confines of a romantic relationship, right? Because if I didn't genuinely think that that was the best action, then why would I have chosen it, right? And if it is indeed the best action, it's not just an idiosyncratic good action for me, it's how I think that people should act. And we can extrapolate that to others. Whenever you go to your job and you put in, an honest day's labor for honest day's pay, well, that's not just an idiosyncratic choice on your behalf. What you're really saying is that, this is how people should act. People should do what they're paid to do. People should be respectful of the time that other people, that other people have afforded them. People should, earn the wages that they have contracted into. So Again, it's not just your actions aren't just these idiosyncratic, the results of these idiosyncratic preferences of yours. What you're really saying, whenever you make an action, is that this is how people should live. Now, let me interrupt myself here and say that whenever Jean-Paul Sartre is talking about choices and the importance of choice, and you bearing the burden of responsibility for your choices, we're not talking about every choice, right? We're talking about moments of existential choice. And it sounds like I'm offering a circular definition here of, important choice as an existential choice because we're talking about existentialism here. But what we mean by that, whenever Jean-Paul Sartre talks about existential choice or momentous choice, he's talking about the kind of choices that result in you becoming something. Whenever I make a choice of either to, wear brown shoes or black shoes, that is not an existential choice. I don't become a certain kind of person as a result of his choice to wear a certain color of shoe. If I choose to cheat on my wife, I do in fact become a certain kind of person, right? I become a cheater. In that moment whenever I choose, if I would choose to cheat on my wife, the result of that choice is I become a certain kind of person. I'm a cheater, right? And what would make you a cheater? Well, you made the choice to cheat on your wife, right? I become a certain kind of person as a result of that choice. You don't become a certain kind of person because you ate tuna fish instead of chicken, right? That's a choice, but it's not an existential choice. Your choice to drink iced tea instead of lemonade, it's a choice. It's not an existential choice because you don't become a certain kind of person as a result of that choice. Choosing to, cheat on your wife, that's an existential choice. Choosing to have kids, that's an existential choice, right? Those are the kinds of choices that we are talking about here. And whenever we make those choices, not those idiosyncratic ones, right? Those momentous choices. What we're really saying is this is how people should live, not just me, everyone. These highlighted terms here, anguish, abandonment, and despair, these are existentialist terms. And this is part of what constitutes the difference between a subject and an object. Remember, subjects have to make choices, objects don't. But because subjects have to make choices, we experience anguish, we experience abandonment, and we experience despair. So Jean-Paul Sartre is going to be defining what he means by each of those. First is what is meant by anguish. Anguish is just the result of being in a situation where you have to make a choice. Should I do this or should I do that, right? Should I get married? Should I stay single? Should I go to college? Should I start my own business, right? Those are all the kinds of choices that people are faced with that are existential in nature, right? You become a certain kind of person as a result of the choice. Nobody's born, a business owner. You become a business owner. And how do you become a business owner? By making the choice to start a business, right? Nobody is born, with a college degree. You become a college graduate. And how do you become a college graduate? Well, by making the choice to go to college, right? That's how you become those things. It's not written in the stars. Nobody has to go to law school. Nobody has to be an engineer. Nobody has to be an auto mechanic. And yet people become those things. And how do they become those things? Well, clearly from the choices that they make. And a dog doesn't experience anguish over how it should live its life, right? Human beings will. Human beings will be in this position of anguish. And the source of anguish is because we know that we cannot exist without making choices. We know that we have to make a choice. And we also want to make the right choice. But the problem is we don't know what the right choices are. And that's what gives us this feeling of anguish. And yet we have to make choices anyway. And that's the burden that comes with this ability to choose, right? That's just the burden that is associated with being an ethical subject rather than an ethical object. In talking about this sort of passage here about anguish, John Chafee says the following: if we are truly honest with ourselves, we realize the distressing and inescapable fact that we alone have to decide what is the right thing to do, and there is no one to rely on for advice other than ourselves. Now, some of you might be tempted to say, well, that's not entirely true. We can go to our grandparents and ask for their advice. We can go to our, preachers and ministers and priests and ask them for advice. And yes, that's technically true, but notice that you still have to be the one to accept that advice or not, right? And so you can solicit the opinions of others, but guess who's still got to make the choice? It's got to be you. You have got to be the one to make the choice. And why were you asking all these other people for their advice in the first place? Because you didn't know what to do. But guess who's responsible for that? Not them, right? It's you, because you are the one who's got to make the choice. And there's no escaping that choice. And that's what is part of what Jean-Paul Sartre means whenever he says that we are condemned to be free. This term here, inauthentic, I mentioned it in passing earlier. What Jean-Paul Sartre means by the authentic person is the person who realizes that they have to make a choice, and they make the choice with the full willingness to accept, the consequences of that action. So we can understand the inauthentic person as the person who rejects that. The inauthentic person is the person that says, I didn't have a choice, right? The inauthentic person is the person that shrugs and says, what else was I supposed to do? I just had to do that. And that's where Jean-Paul Sartre's going to step in and remind people. It's like, you don't have to do anything, right? You are free. You are radically free. You are condemned to be free. Just because your parents were abusive alcoholics doesn't mean that you have to be an abusive alcoholic. Just because your parents were Catholic, that doesn't mean that you have to be Catholic, right? Just because your parents got married and had kids doesn't mean that you have to get married and have kids. You get to do whatever the heck you want. You are free. You are radically free. You are condemned to be free. Don't get married just because society says to get married, right? You would be an inauthentic person. You'd just be going along with the crowd, driving a certain kind of car just because everyone else is driving it. Going to college simply because everyone you went to high school with went to go to college. Like, well, I guess I'll allow them to make a decision for me, right? That's you being inauthentic. And what Sartre is going to say is that, living an inauthentic life is not the life that you want to live. You want to live an authentic life. But to live an authentic life, you've got to make those choices yourself. This military officer example that Jean-Paul Sartre uses is an example of somebody who is being inauthentic by trying to avoid the responsibility of their actions. The standard example of the military officer says, well, hey, what was I supposed to do? I was just following orders. I had to do this action. And why did I have to do that action? Well, General so-and-so told me that I had to do it. So therefore, I'm not responsible for anything that happened. That other person's responsible. And what Jean-Paul Sartre's going to say is, oh, no. You can't blame anybody else. Because just because that general told you to do something doesn't mean that you have to do it, right? It was up to you to follow that order. Now, there might be some consequences with disobeying an order from a general, but just because there are negative consequences associated with disobeying a direct order doesn't mean that you're not free to do it, right? And that's what Jean-Paul Sartre's going to do, is remind you of your freedom. You don't have to do anything. If you don't want to study for the exam, don't study for the exam. You might fail as a result of that, but you're still free, right? You don't have to study. You don't go to work if you don't want to, right? You don't have to go to work. Just go ahead and skip. Just go drink beer on the river all day. Now, you might get fired as a result of that, right? But it doesn't mean that you're not free to not do it. You're always free. You're condemned to be free. You always have a choice, and that's what Jean-Paul Sartre is going to be hammering home there. I'm starting to go along here, at 29 minutes, so I'm going to try to wrap up these last couple of pages here pretty quickly. Abandonment. What Jean-Paul Sartre means by abandonment goes back to this idea that there's nobody that can help us make these decisions, because even if we solicit the opinions of somebody else, we are ultimately the ones that have to decide, that have to choose what avenue to go down. So we're alone. That's what it means to be abandoned. You can offer a prayer, You can, say, well, God, what should I do? You can go to your parents, what should I do? You can go to your best friend, what should I do? But you still have to be the one to make the choice, and hence the responsibility for your action is always on you. And then finally, this last existential concept, despair. This notion of despair coming from this full weight. You think of this choice. So Jean-Paul Sartre says you are free. There's nothing that you have to do. You don't have to live any kind of life. You're free to do whatever the heck you want. Now that sounds like a great thing at first, right? Because wow, I'm not burdened with, with anything. There's nothing that I have to do. I can live my own darn life, right? I can make whatever kind of choices that I want to make. But there's a flip side of that precisely because I'm free, I now have this burden of responsibility. I want to do the right thing, but I don't know what the right thing is. And that's where this sense of despair comes from. We're staring into the abyss, knowing that we have to make right choices, and yet we don't know what those right choices are, and we have to choose anyway. That's what results in despair. And there might be this tendency to say, well, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to do nothing. I'm just going to cross my arms and and just not make a choice at all. And what Sartre is going to say is, you're choosing not to choose. And the choice not to choose is itself a choice, right? And that's the sense in which there is no escape from our responsibility. And now we have a greater understanding of what Sartre means when he says that we are condemned to be free. Normally, whenever we speak of somebody as being condemned, it means their freedom's been taken away from them, right? But Sartre uses this phrase, you are condemned to be free, meaning that you can't avoid it. Even crossing your arms and doing nothing is a choice, and you're going to be responsible for that choice. These highlighted paragraphs here, again, Sartre is giving us different examples of what inauthenticity or bad faith looks like. The person that says, I had no choice. My circumstances dictated my behavior. I had a gun to my head. What was I supposed to do? Well, what Jean-Paul Sartre's going to say is that, well, just because somebody had a just because somebody had a gun to your head asking you to open up a bank vault, doesn't mean that you had to open up the bank vault, right? Now, you could have refused, and you probably would have got shot in the head as a result of that, which is something that you didn't want to happen. But just because there's a bad consequence associated with a choice doesn't mean that there's not a choice, Sartre is going to say. He's going to say there's always a choice, and because there's always a choice, there's always this burden of responsibility, and that burden of responsibility is unavoidable. You are condemned to be free. And the last thing I'll mention here, Jean-Paul Sartre says, when we as existentialists say, you are nothing else than your life. You are what you do. You are the choices that you make. You don't get to call yourself a charitable person if you never donate money to charity, right? Think of how many people will say these absurd things like, well, I'm not giving anything to charity now, but whenever I win the lotto, I'm going to be the most generous person you ever met in your life. Now, those people, they think of themselves as charitable because of what they might do in some future tortured circumstance. Well, what Jean-Paul Sartre's going to do is say, no. You don't get to claim credit for something that you haven't done. You don't get to claim credit for something that you might do at some uncertain future point. You only get credit for what you do, the choices that you actually make. Just because you plan on running in a marathon 2 years from now doesn't mean that you get to call yourself a marathon runner, right? You're only a marathon runner if you make the choice to run marathons. Just because you're thinking about running a marathon doesn't mean that you can consider yourself a marathon runner. Just because you're thinking about, being faithful to your romantic partner doesn't mean that you're a faithful romantic partner. You're only a faithful romantic partner if you're making the choice to be a faithful romantic partner. Okay, I'm going to bring it to an end there. We've talked about everything that was pertinent for the reading assignment, so I'm going to bring this video to a close. I will ask you to enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next video.